How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel. Trade is one of the game mechanics that is not very well understood by most players, and yet it is a vital part of playing any EU4 game. I think the main barrier to understanding trade mechanics are the in-game screens for trade and trade nodes. All these screens are filled with numbers, making them a bit intimidating, frankly. Trade is a global network between all countries, so the calculations involved can get a bit complex, but in this video, we are not looking to delve deep into calculations and equations, and I'll try to summarize the trade mechanics in game in a way that's relevant to gameplay. We could open a calculator and a spreadsheet to follow each number on screen and figure out how it came to be, but this video series is for newcomers, and I think EU4 is already daunting enough for new players that we don't need to inject spreadsheets and calculators in there. I mean, I love some spreadsheet action myself, but it's entirely unnecessary here. In case you do want to know the nitty-gritty of trade, all the information is available on the EU4 wiki. The information that we will discuss on this video is also available on the wiki. It's just a bit spread out, and my aim with this video is to summarize it all in a way that's easier to understand. Another thing I wanted to mention before we start is that trade mechanics have been changed in almost every patch, so this guide might not hold true for later patches. I'm making this video on 1.26 Mughals update and Dharma DLC. I'll try to put up an update video when there are changes to trade in future. With that thought, let's jump into it. I realized this video was going to be too long, so I have divided into two parts. Each part is divided into several sections to make it easier to understand. First, let's start with basic trade goods. Every province produces a trade good, and the price of that particular trade good is same all over the world. This value might change based on some worldwide event. Wiki has a list of trade goods, and you can sort it by price to see which trade goods have higher prices. The higher the price, the more money it makes. This trade price is the basis of all calculations in trade, and those calculations are done by trade value. Trade value is calculated by goods produced multiplied by price of trade good. What is goods produced, you ask? It's simply the production value of a province multiplied by 0.2. So this trade value is the value of that province you will see in the trade node screen. Simple so far, yeah? In summary, trade value of a province is determined by the trade good and the production development, sometimes also called diplo development. So if you want to increase the trade value of a province, you can't get a new trade good as those are fixed, but you can spend diplo points to buy the diplo or production development of that province. Now there are other modifiers that affect the trade value here, but we'll cover them in the last section. If we cover them now, it might get a little bit too confusing, so let's first get our basics straight. While we are on the topic of trade goods, I will cover other aspects of it briefly. It's good to know offhand which trade goods are the best and worst. You can refer to the wiki trade goods list for it. Basically, grain and fish are the worst, while cocoa, dyes, ivory are some of the best trade goods. You also get some bonuses from trade goods. First is the province bonus. Each trade good provides some bonus to the province it's in. Second is the trading in bonus. It's activated if you control at least 20% of global trade in that trade good. Third is the production bonus, which is a flat 10% goods produced modifier when you are the production leader for any trade good. List of all these bonuses can be found on wiki as well. Gold is a trade good, but it doesn't produce any trade value. It's a special case. The value of gold is directly converted into income, and you can see that from your economy screen. Alright, so we have a trade value for a province. What happens to it now? This trade value goes to the trade node. Every province belongs to a trade node, and the whole EU4 map is divided into several trade nodes. You can check this in the trade map mode. All trade nodes in the map are connected together in a global network by incoming and outgoing trade flows. You can see the arrows on the trade map mode as well. Most trade nodes will have some incoming and some outgoing trade flows. The direction of these trade flows are fixed and do not change in game. Some trade nodes though don't have outgoing and incoming trade flows, such as California, Great Lakes and Siam nodes are outgoing only with nothing upstream to them, and English Channel, Genoa and Venice are incoming only with nothing downstream to them. These incoming only nodes are also called end nodes. Remember that one, it's going to come handy later. Each country has a main trade city, which is the capital at the start, and you can move your main trade city for a cost of 200 diplo points. Having a main trade city in a trade node gives you more money there, which is the reason you might want to move it, but you don't need to worry about that now. Now, how much money you get from your trade node will depend on your trade power, which brings us to the next section. Trade power is a country's control over trade in a node. The absolute value of trade power is meaningless. What matters is the percentage of trade power in comparison to other countries. So obviously you want to have more trade power in a trade node. How do we do that? Trade power is generated by control of provinces with trade goods that we learned earlier. Each province has a trade power that is determined by its total development. Higher development means more trade power. 2 by trade ships, also called light ships, and 3 by merchants. Alright, so now we figured out that we have some trade value here based on our provinces and some trade power in this trade node. And we know how to increase trade power here. But how does this trade power convert to real income for your country? There are 2 ways you can use this trade power to get money: collecting trade or transferring trade. Let's look at collecting trade first. Remember your main trade city? You automatically collect from trade node of your main trade city. The amount you collect here is determined by the total trade value in node and the percentage of your trade power. Notice here that it's the total trade value produced in the trade node. It doesn't matter if you control the province or not. What matters is what percentage of trade power you control in that trade node. All countries with a trade power in a node are competing against each other for this money. Your early game strategy should be to get more trade power in your home trade node. Easiest and most straightforward way of doing this is by owning the higher development province in the trade node area. Another strategy is that if you're looking to change your main trade city, you should consider the trade power you have in different nodes. And since it's an investment of 200 diplo points, you need to make sure that you will have high trade power there for a long time. Although you will rarely change your main trade city early game. It's more of a late game mechanic, so beginners don't need to worry about it right now. You can also collect trade in a node that's not your home trade node by using a merchant. We will talk about that later when we discuss merchants in detail. Before that, let's look at what transferring trade does. If you look at the trade node screen, you will see incoming, local, and outgoing values. The local value is the trade value of all provinces in that node. And if you hover your mouse over it, it will show you which province is contributing how much trade value. The incoming trade value is the trade value that is being transferred to this trade node from a node upstream, and the outgoing trade value is the trade value that is being transferred from this trade node to a node downstream. Now the game calculates transferring trade in 2 stages, and this is probably the most complicated and unintuitive part of trade. I will try to simplify it without getting into too many equations, and I don't believe new EU4 players need an in-depth knowledge of how this mechanic works. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to know the nitty-gritty of it, I'll refer you to the wiki. For the first stage in calculating trade transfer, we will look at this pie chart. It shows you how much of trade value is retained in the node and how much is pulled forward. In this stage, all countries transferring trade work together against countries that are collecting trade in this trade node. And you can see that by the forward sign, that country is transferring trade, and the plus sign, which means the country is collecting trade. So stage 1 is countries transferring trade versus countries collecting trade. And the result is this pie chart, which determines how much money is retained in the node and how much money is forwarded. Now for the second stage, the game calculates where to steer the forwarded trade. It's important to know the difference between transferring trade and steering trade. As you see in the trade map mode, this node is transferring the outgoing trade value to all these nodes denoted by outgoing arrows. Now countries can assign merchants to trade nodes to steer this outgoing trade value to a particular node. The value that you see here is the value of steered trade going in this particular direction, and that is calculated by total outgoing trade value and the proportion of trade power of countries steering trade in this direction as opposed to countries steering trade in other directions. Notice in this equation, the steered trade value is dependent only on countries that steer trade. So you can be a country that has a huge amount of trade power in a node, but if you're not steering trade, you have no control on which direction all the outgoing trade value goes to. It might still go where you want to if other nations are steering it towards your home trade node, but you will have zero control over it. With me so far? Let's quickly summarize what we have learned. Every province you own has a trade good giving a trade value and a trade power to that province. All provinces in a trade node are combined together to find out the local trade value of the node. What happens to this trade value is determined by who has more trade power in the province. Trade power is affected by province development, light ships, and merchants. A country can choose to collect trade in the node, which is how they convert this trade value to trade income. every country automatically collects trade in their home trade node. A country can also transfer this trade value to a node downstream. The value of this transfer trade is determined by percentage of trade power of nations compared to other nations in the node. A country can also assign merchants to a node to steer it towards their home node. The value of this steered trade value is determined by total outgoing value and percentage of total trade power that is being applied by one or more nations to steer trade in that particular direction. A country that doesn't have a merchant in the node does not control where the trade is steered to. You guys still with me? Good. Now we learned earlier that trade power is generated by province, lightships, and merchants. So let's briefly look at these sources of trade power. It's important to understand them as having more trade power means more ducats for you. We saw earlier that each province provides trade power to the trade node it's in. This is called the provincial trade power, which depends on a lot of factors. You should know some of them so you can choose which province to target first for maximum trade power in the node. High development province means more trade power. Center of trades and estuaries give extra bonus to trade power as well and should be targeted first for conquest. Burghers give 50% trade power bonus, so it's a good idea to give a center of trade province to burghers. You can also increase trade power of a province by buildings such as marketplace, trade depot, and stock exchanges. Mercantilism is a modifier that affects provincial trade power too. You can increase mercantilism by events or by spending diplo points. If you assign a province to a trade company, it increases the trade power by 100%, and in the new patch you can do some investments in the trade company area to increase the trade power further. We'll discuss that part in separate sections. Next, let's look at lightships or trade ships. You can set a lightship to protect trade in a trade node. This gives you extra trade power in the node. The amount of trade power is dependent on how many ships you have protecting trade, and it also scales with newer ships that you get from better diplotechs. This trade power is called ship trade power, and it can be further modified by merchant navy naval doctrine, admiral with maneuver pips or a specific trait, some national ideas, and by being in a trade league. You can only send lightships to nodes where you have some trade power and is within your naval supply range. Propagation of trade power is a simple concept. Basically, 1/5 or 20% of the provincial trade power a nation has in a node is transferred to the next immediate node upstream. This is denoted by transfer of traders downstream in the trade node screen. You need to have at least 10 provincial trade power in a node to get this propagation of trade power perk. One of the modifiers that increases this propagation is the Age of Reformation ability of ship trade propagation, which gives extra 20% of the trade power propagation provided by your lightships in the node. There are other sources of trade power as well. You get trade power from your main trade city, as we saw earlier. You get extra trade power by being in a trade league. You can force other nations to transfer trade power to you, either diplomatically, where you can scale the amount of trade power depending on opinion modifiers and relative strength of nations, or by war, where you will get 50% trade power for the duration of the truce. This is a great way to increase your trade power in a node. As we learned earlier, trade power is only relevant as a percentage compared to other nations. So by this mechanic, we are increasing our trade power while simultaneously decreasing others. You also get some trade power from your subjects. You get 50% trade power automatically from your colonial subjects. You can also get 100% trade power from your vassals and march, but that costs 30% liberty desire in that subject. You don't get any trade power from your personal union partners. Another way to increase trade power is by merchants, which we will discuss in the part 2 of this video series.